This is Lecture 36A, The Empire Strikes Back Against South America, Plan Condor, Part 1. A decade later, the Empire decided to double down after its relatively successful activities in Guatemala, for example, but also El Salvador. And in the previous lectures, we have gone through Mexico, Central America, and Panama with regard to what happened in the last half century. So now what we're going to do is take a look at what happened in South America. Operation Condor was also known as Plan Condor, and it was a U.S. government organized campaign of state terrorism. The plan began with intelligence gathering, then proceeded through black operations, as they're called, and culminated in riots and assassinations. It was officially implemented in 1974 by the CIA, NSA, and the Defense and State Departments of the USA against South America. The plan targeted what the gringo fascists considered communist ideas among the people of South America by killing the idea carriers. Now, this program that had been tested and practiced in Central America was being exported to all of South America. And I don't think I have to refer you to the previous half dozen lectures that we've had on that subject in Central America. This meant that the nations of the South American continent were doomed for the next 20 years at least to suffer a new form of gringoism, namely the physical destruction of progressive political organizations and groups wherever they existed. Now, Operation Condor was specifically patterned by its designers after the pre-World War II Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese fascist parties and their governments, and of course the Hitlerites and their puppet regimes. Accordingly, with the defeat of the Italians and Germans, there was an exodus of escaped war criminals from Europe landing in Latin America. In 1948, the U.S. CIA, now newly formed, took over where the U.S. Army had left off in recruiting these war criminals to lead this program. At least 9,000 war criminals from the Second World War escaped to South America, including Croatians, Ukrainians, Russians, and other Western Europeans who had aided the Nazi murder machine. Most, perhaps as many as 5,000, went to Argentina. 2,000 more made it to Brazil, and another 1,000 war criminals made it from Germany and Italy to Chile. The rest went on to Paraguay and Uruguay. In these countries, the U.S. CIA, as the operators for Plan Condor, eventually recruited them. The defeat of the U.S. by the Cubans, that was made as permanent as possible in the U.S.-Soviet settlement of the missile crisis of October 1962, laid the basis. Having failed to destroy the rebel base, and having been forced to forego the idea of eliminating it by armed force, the gringo fascists had to back up, and they had to come up with another program to stop the spread of rebel ideas. This new program was what they called Operation Condor. Condor's mission was to impose fascism in the U.S. preferred image on the Western Hemisphere south of the Rio Grande. That preferred image was gringo rule, as guerrilla rule as the U.S. Viceroyalty's allies. Now, I'm using the term guerrilla the way it traditionally was used in Latin America, like the gorilla of the zoo, Gorilla, where the idea was that any thug that can get on a uniform and stop drinking long enough or snorting coke long enough to carry out his orders from Washington will be just fine. That's exactly what they wanted. This is not the guerrilla, the way we use the term guerrilla when we're talking in Che Guevara terms of armed struggle. As we saw in the preceding chapters, the Proto-Condor plan had been kicked off in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua after 1945. In other words, Truman had ordered all of the embassies to do everything they could to eliminate all communist ideas, organizations, and people. Now, these fascist guerrilla installation operations prevailed throughout the 1950s, and now in the 1960s, the North American fascists were kicking off the same campaign against the rest of Latin America. You recall that the U.S.-Soviet agreement on Cuba, which had prevented where the U.S. had promised never again to use its military forces to attack Cuba, although there was the caveat that if individual CIA agents could arrange some kind of assassination of Fidel Castro, well, that wasn't covered by the U.S.-Soviet agreement, but for practical purposes, the rebel base was as secure as was possible to get. Now, in Plan Condor, there are at least 60,000 deaths attributed to Condor by the gringo media, that is, by the official U.S. press, both printed and electronic. Condor's essential government members became the U.S.-sponsored fascist coup-installed governments of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Brazil. Now, each of these coup-installed regimes relied upon the U.S. Pentagon and secret agents from the above-listed U.S. government entities who directed alliances with local ruling class families that formed fascist foci. Accordingly, the U.S. government provided technical support and supplied military aid to them. After Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, such direction and support was taken from the Pentagon and almost exclusively centralized in the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA operated through fronts, as well as clandestinely, the so-called Black Ops. The most important fronts, but certainly not the only such fronts, were the DEA, USAID, and the Inter-American Bank. In the U.S. cap press, these efforts came to be referred to as the U.S. Dirty War. French lessons. In 1957, Argentine officers, among them Alcides Lopez Alfranc, went to Paris to attend 2-year courses at the École de Guerre military school, School of War in English, or War School we would call it in the States. In 1959, French instructors followed them back to Argentina. The arrival of the French instructors in Argentina led to a massive extension of the Argentine thug intelligence services and their use of torture as the primary instrument of the anti-subversive war. The annihilation decrees of 1974, signed by Juan Perón's second wife, Isabel Perón, were written by these French instructors for her. You will recall that Isabel was the pale replacement of Juan Perón's first wife, Evita Duarte, and had returned to Buenos Aires with him in 1974. In the archives of the Quai d'Orsay, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, French journalist Marie-Monique Robin found proof of the French-Argentine conspiracy to utilize terror via kidnapping, torture, and the disappearing of leftists. This in the form of an original document proving that the 1959 agreement between Paris and Buenos Aires set up a permanent French military mission of officers in Argentina. The assigned officers had all been vetted and experienced in the dirty war France had conducted in Algeria. This military mission of experienced murderers and torturers was located in the offices of the Chief of Staff of the Argentine Army. It continued until François Mitterrand was elected President of France in 1981. Robin showed how Valéry Giscard d'Estaing's government secretly collaborated with Videla's junta in Argentina and with Augusto Pinochet's regime in Chile. The junta copies the French Dirty War. Reinaldo Bignone, named president of the Argentinian junta in July '82, said, quote, "The March 1976 order of battle is a copy of the Algerian battle," unquote. This was a direct reference to the French use of torture, disappearances, and murder in the Battle of Algiers. In that battle, Algiers police forces were put under the authority of the French Army paratroopers. They systematically used torture during interrogations and began to disappear suspects as part of their program of intimidation. And now, the new president of the junta, the new military president of Argentina, is saying we're going to do exactly the same thing. Well, the 10th of September in 2003, French Green Party deputies Noël Mamère, Martine Billard, and Yves Cochet petitioned for a parliamentary commission to be established by the Foreign Affairs Commission of the National Assembly to examine, quote, the role of France in the support of military regimes in Latin America from 1973 to 1984, unquote. In the event, it was presided over by Edouard Balladur. The only newspaper to report this was Le Monde. French lies. Deputy Roland Blum, in charge of the commission, refused to allow Marie-Monique Robin to testify. Robin described the government's report in December 2003 as being in the utmost bad faith because it lied in saying that no agreement had ever been signed on this issue between France and Argentina. The official lies continued when French Minister of Foreign Affairs Dominique de Villepin traveled to Chile in February 2004. There he said that there has been no cooperation between France and the military regimes, although he was well aware that there had indeed been close collaboration. Reporter Marie-Monique Robin said to the French Communist Party newspaper Le Manité, quote, the French have systematized a military technique in the urban environment that would be copied and passed to Latin American dictatorships, unquote. She further elaborated that the methods employed during the 1957 Battle of Algiers were systematized and exported to the war school in Buenos Aires. Roger Trinkier's famous book on counterinsurgency had a very strong influence in South America. Robin said that she was shocked to learn that the French intelligence agency, Direction de Surveillance des Territoires, DST, communicated to the Chilean secret thug police, DINA, D-I-N-A, the names of refugees who returned to Chile. Operation Retorno, it was called, all of whom had been picked up by the DINA and then killed. She said, quote, of course this puts the French government in the dock, and Giscard d'Estaing, then President of the Republic. I was very shocked by the duplicity of the French diplomatic position, which at the same time received political refugees with open arms and collaborated with the dictatorship. The role of the Catholic Church in the mass murder. Marie-Monique Robin proved also that the French far right had been working in Argentina since the 1930s through the Roman Catholic fundamentalist organization Cité Catholique, which roughly translated to English means Catholic Summons. Jean Osset, a former secretary of Charles Maurras, founder of the Royalist Action Française movement, had created the Summons, or the Cité. Catholic Summons published a review, La Verbe, which instructed military officers during the Algerian War in the use of torture. At the end of the 1950s, the Catholic Summons established groups in Argentina and set up cells in the army. It greatly expanded during the government of General Juan Carlos Onganía, in particular in 1969. The key figure of Catholic Summons, Cité Catholique, was the priest Georges Grasset, who became President Jorge Rafael Videla's personal confessor. Videla was president of Argentina from 1976 to 1981, head of the military junta, in other words. He had been the spiritual guide of the Organización de Armée Secrète, known as the OAS, Secret Army Organization, in Algeria and in France. It was the terrorist organization of those Frenchmen unwilling to give Algeria independence. Assassinations and bombings were its principal tactics. In actuality, it had been based on the Spanish fascist phalangist terror operation in Franco's Spain. And the OAS was the subject of several famous books and movies, which you may be familiar with. Robin says that this Catholic fundamentalist current in the Argentine army contributed to the importance and duration of Franco-Argentine cooperation. In Buenos Aires, Georges Grasset maintained links with Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, founder of the Society of St. Pius X in 1970, who was excommunicated in 1988 when he refused to submit to discipline from the Holy Office in Rome. The Society of Pius X was a secret terror organization that had 4 monasteries in Argentina. The largest is in La Reja. According to Marie-Monique Robin, one of its priests told her, quote, to save the soul of a communist priest, one must kill him, unquote. Luis Roldan, former Undersecretary of Religion under Carlos Menem, President of Argentina and of the junta from 1989 to 1999, was presented to Robin by Dominique Lagal as the priest in charge of the monastery, who called himself Mr. Cite Catholique in Argentina. Today, Bruno Guinta and Juan Carlos Goyeneche represent the Catholic summons and its ideology. Now, on the Argentine war crimes and criminals, Argentine Admiral Luis Maria Mendia, who had theorized the practice of death flights, testified in January 2007 before Argentine judges that a French intelligence agent named Bertrand de Perceval had participated in the abduction of two French nuns, Léonique Duquet and Alice Daumont, who were later murdered. Naturally, Perceval, who lives today in Thailand, denied any links with the abduction. He, however, admitted to being a member of the OAS, the French Secret Army organization, and having escaped France for Argentina after the March 1962 Evian Accords that ended the Algerian War. Referring to Marie-Monique Robin's film documentary titled The Death Squads, The French School, and then I give the name in French, Luis Maria Mendia asked the Argentine High Court to indict those responsible. Those named were former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, former French Premier Pierre Mesmer, former French Ambassador to Buenos Aires, François de la Gorce, as well as all officials in place in the French mission. The indictment charging grave crimes. Mendia's indictment accuses former head of state Isabel Perón and former Argentine ministers Carlos Rucaf and Antonio Cafiero, who had signed the anti-subversion decrees before Videla's 1976 coup d'etat, all charged with crimes against humanity. Now, according to torture survivor Graciela Daleo, the claim that the crimes were legal under Isabel Perón's anti-subversion decree is not an allowable legal defense. She notes that torture is forbidden by the Argentine Constitution. Alfredo Astiz, a Marine known as the Blonde Angel of Death because of his torture, also referred to the original French connection at his trial. U.S. imperialism supplants French imperialism as torture and murder bosses. Gringo agents approached already well-established fascist security services in Chile, Brazil, Argentina. Now, Brazil, Bolivia, and Uruguay, they were approached for consultation on how to create Operation Condor. Their pitch was simple. The U.S. would provide the money without limit to finance the elimination of Marxist subversion in these countries. All the thug services had to do was to provide the torturers and killers who would be very well paid. And to this the thugs concurred. An instrumentalizing agreement was formalized during the Conference of American Armies held in Caracas on the 3rd of September 1973. At that conference, Brazilian General Breno Borges Fortes, acting as head of the Brazilian Army, proposed to exchange information between various thug services to begin the struggle against left subversion. The plan had only to be formally named. In March 1974, representatives of the police forces of Chile, Uruguay, and Bolivia met with Alberto Villar, deputy chief of the Argentine Federal Police and co-founder of the AAA Death Squad, to implement action. The action plan had, as of that moment, not yet acquired a name. The thug services did not need a name to begin their murdering of thousands of political exiles in Argentina. Accordingly, the Cap Press in Argentina and the USA reported in August 1974 that corpses of Bolivian refugees were found in garbage dumps in Buenos Aires. Condor gets its name. On the 25th of November 1975, leaders of the military intelligence services of Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay met with Manuel Contreras, chief of DINA, the Chilean Secret Police, DINA, in Santiago de Chile, officially creating Plan Condor. Documents now available from the U.S. CIA show that CIA bosses directed the abduction and torture, targeting these Chilean and Uruguayan refugees who were living in Buenos Aires. According to the aforementioned French journalist Marie-Monique Robin, who you will recall is the author of The Death Squads, The French School, published in 2004, General Rivero personally named the project Operation Condor. He was the intelligence chief for the Argentine Armed Forces and former French torture student. China intervenes against the imperialist empires striking back. Chinese intelligence intervened against U.S. imperialism in South America following a visit to Beijing by Abimael Guzman in 1975. China acceded to Guzman's request for assistance by providing advice and guidance and, to the degree possible, intelligence instruments. Accordingly, Guzman launched the Communist Party of Peru, shining path of Carlos Mariátegui. Guzman's first attack on the fascist troops of Lima occurred in 1977. In the decade following 1977, Guzman's party was the most important organizing element in Peru's fight against the empire striking back. The PCP-SLCM, to use the Spanish initials for Guzman's party, organized People's War against U.S. imperialism and its fascist compradors in Peru. Now, the rebel base in Cuba also tried to help Peru. Although the Cuban DGI, that's General Direction of Intelligence in English, tried to help in Peru, also the Abimael Guzman Communist Party physically liquidated the Cuban effort when it actually made headway, which was not often. The Cuban-lining communists were having trouble recruiting via Guzman's party. The Brezhnev modern revisionists had lost all credibility and had no discernible apparatus in Peru when I was there in these years. The Senderistas had had a head start and had captured the imagination of a generation of progressive youth in the cities of Lima and Trujillo, which I have discussed in the third volume of my Idaho Smith series. At any rate, the overthrow of Cuban and Soviet-supported Colonel Velasco had struck a temporarily fatal blow to the Cuban brand of Marxism-Leninism, which was confused in youthful minds with Soviet modern revisionism. The rebel base fights back across the rest of South America. However, the Cuban DGI became the sword and shield of the proletarian and campesino resistance in the rest of Latin America. It was the primary instrument of the Cuban rebel base in providing assistance to the popular movements as soon as it became apparent that the Grego regime was switching its focus from Central America to South America. As Proto-Plan Condor unfolded in the 1960s, so did the rebel resistance. The Cuban internationalist leadership, led by Fidel Castro, decided to send Che Guevara to Bolivia, where he was captured and murdered in 1967. Thereafter, as formally designated Condor unfolded by 1974, simultaneously both Cuba and China began the complete re-infiltration of the U.S. intelligence and military communities. In so doing, they were replacing the Soviet KGB, which had completely penetrated the CIA and FBI under Stalin, only then to be de facto stood down by the Khrushchev gang of modern revisionists. The counter-revolution of Moscow's modern revisionists was kicked off from 1953 through 1959, everywhere except in Cuba. The modern revisionists were now only going to support revolutionary movements if and when those movements supported other Soviet government goals. They were at war with those of us who were allied with the Cuban rebel base area, and we had to be as mindful of them as our other sworn enemies, the U.S. CIA and its ilk. As I say, the Chica had been ordered de facto to stand down as far as providing direct assistance to indigenous revolutionary resistance movements in Latin America, except as specifically directed from Moscow. During this time, I was associated with many friends of the Cuban and Chinese intelligence services, as well as independent revolutionary communist movements. Along the way, some of my closest friends gave their lives in their dedication to the fight for communism. Denis Prieto Stock was one such friend who died for the Mexican Revolution, and accordingly is one of the two persons to whom this textbook is dedicated. The other dedicatee being Frank Postada, whom Chairman Mao called his leading intelligence outpost on the west coast of North America. When the return of the Bolshoi began after the defeat of the Empire Strike Back program, the spearhead role of the DGI would gradually give way to Cuba's International Medical Assistance Brigades. These became one of Cuba's main instruments in proving the superiority of socialism over capitalism as a world socio-cultural evolutionary stage. In time, they would become Cuba's most important political weapon. In the accompanying lecture series, I shall discuss the fights as I remember them and came to know them, and I will let you read between the lines about my own role. Now, an outline of the criminal history of capitalism, preparation for the Gringo assault from Guatemala to Colombia. Now, just as Britain and France developed and exploited the opium trade against China in the 1800s, the U.S. government agencies did the same thing in the 1900s against Soviet Russia, its allies, and China. Instrumentalizing this, they used the same strategy. That is, they expanded beyond opium syndicates they had used against China to using Latin American drug cartels. Gringo spies have always used narcotics and organized crime to further their political objectives. Accordingly, it became necessary for the revolutionary communist movement in Latin America to penetrate the coterie of criminal cartels in the drug business so that we allied with some against others. This recognition of an illegal as well as legal dichotomy in the international capitalist class had always been part of the worldview of Third International Intelligence Forces. What evolved over the last century was the increasing emphasis on drug trafficking among the illegal element of the international cap class. This was increasingly where the money was. Therefore, that was where our intelligence penetrations became increasingly thorough. The cap class itself graduated in its illegal component in the USA from the gangs of Mustache Pete immigrants Salvatore Maranzano and Giuseppe Masseria. Their transformations accomplished gangland style into the crime commission run by the native-born generation of Charles Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Ben Siegel. The takeover of organized crime in Gringolandia began with Charles Luciano and Meyer Lansky, backed by Frank Costello and Ben Siegel in the 1920s. Once established, this brain and muscle trust extended their de facto control through the early 1960s. Then a subsequent generation of criminals combined with traditional cap exploiters emerged under the leadership of George Herbert Walker Bush. We discussed this in previous lectures, and I won't go into his details again. They're in the book also when you get it. The latter had begun with his base in Zapata offshore, featuring his alliance with Jorge Diaz Serrano, as I've already discussed this in some detail in the previous Empire Strikes Back in Mexico, Chapter 46. Then, after the JFK assassination that George H.W. Bush supervised, he became CIA boss. Then, with his own government-paid-for thugs, he took over Proto-Plan Condor, making it into Plan Condor. As I say, Plan Condor continued under his, that is, George H.W. Bush's direction when he became CIA chief. From time to time, his black operations programs surfaced in the U.S. cap press with such highlights as the Iran-Contra scandal and the BCCI scandal. On the Bush watch, not only did the CIA invade and take over Panama, it sponsored the Colombian presidential candidacy of Alvaro Uribe and his narco-paramilitaries. That dirty war also came into the U.S. cap press, but by this time, their secret organization referred to itself as the New World Order, and a central feature of their secret organization was and is its control of the print and electronic media that distorted the Colombian Civil War in its every aspect. In short, the U.S. ruling families and their state and government have always colluded with organized crime to attack perceived enemies. They do so in contemporary times as well. Furthermore, their unnamed ruling circle has all of the USA government and multiple private entities, and it's an integral modern part of the secret coup government that runs Gringolandia today. I say unnamed because they have learned enough not to have a specific name, but the group that's centered around, that calls themselves the Carlyle Group, for example, is a good example of this brain trust. And if you're interested in that, you can certainly look it up. They meet in the Carlyle Hotel once a week. That's where George H.W. Bush meets with them. He gets his daily CIA report, which of course he immediately turns over to them. And so they know everything that the president knows, for example, in the United States, that the CIA reports. At any rate, a large portion of the North American people are reduced to being sheeple. The rest are without unified political representation, susceptible to constant misleading by right-wing socialists like Bernie Sanders and other modern versions of Sam Gompers. Still others susceptible to being misled by anarchism or one of the several modern versions of Trotskyism, such as PSL. Well, at any rate, back at the ranch, as we have just seen, cooperation among various security thug services had existed before the creation of Operation Condor. This cooperation had always been aimed at murdering leftists. We reviewed the 25 November 1975 meeting of the leaders of the military intelligence services of Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. At this meeting, these guerrillas met with Manuel Contreras, chief of DINA, the Chilean secret police, in Santiago de Chile, which brought the Chilean thug service formally into Plan Condor. Now officially, the targets were armed groups, the MIR, the Montoneros, the ERP, and the Tupamaros, opposed to the governments of Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. However, the ruling oligarchs in each of these countries quickly broadened their attacks against all of their political opponents. Their opponents now included the families of political enemies. The Argentine part of this dirty war resulted in at least 30,000 victims. All opponents and their families were subjected to kidnapping, torture, and death. Trade unionists, relatives of activists, social activists, such as the founders of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, nuns, university professors, were among the disappeared, who were always murdered. Always it was the U.S. CIA in the driver's seat. From 1976 onwards, the Chilean DINA and its Argentine counterpart SIDE, S-I-D-E, were the operation's frontline troops. Considerable time was spent in planning disappearances. Among the most popular were the infamous death flights, theorized in Argentina by Luis Maria Mendia and previously used during the Algerian War of 1954 to 1962 by French forces. And these were widely used in practice in Argentina, and specifically government forces took victims by plane or helicopter out to sea, dropping them to their deaths. In late 1977, due to unusual storms, numerous corpses washed up on the beaches south of Buenos Aires, producing evidence of some of the government's victims. There were also hundreds of cases of babies and children being taken from mothers in prison who had been kidnapped and later disappeared, murdered, the children being given in illegal adoptions to military families and associates of the regime. Now to take a look at the principal foci, country by country. Argentina. The Argentine campaign of the CIA lasted a generation from 1974 to 1983. It began with the military coup against the returned Juan Perón and was the first focus of Operation Condor. As such, the Argentine SIDE, S-I-D-E, initiated cooperation with the Chilean DINA, D-I-N-A, in organizing disappearances, desaparecidos. It was an old-world traditional way for mafia criminals in Sicily to get rid of people without leaving a body in a pool of blood, which was always difficult to explain when the dead person had a known grudge against some mafia don or another. And these CIA-allied killers were all just murderers who had this Italian background. Killing communists was one thing, but they assassinated opponents within the state apparatus, beginning with Chilean General Carlos Prats. They graduated to killing former Uruguayan members of parliament, Zelmar Michelini and Hector Gutierrez Ruiz. And then they did their postgraduate work in killing the ex-president of Bolivia, Juan Jose Torres, in Buenos Aires. They were getting quite busy. This Argentine-Italian mafia, that was the SIDE, also assisted Bolivian General Luis Garcia Bea Tejada's cocaine coup in Bolivia. In this, he recruited the escaped war criminals, Italian Gladio operative Stefano de Chie, and French Nazi war criminal Klaus Barbie, in what was called Operation Charlie. The Charlie franchise of Condor. Operation Charlie was the Argentine equivalent to MI6 Universal Exports of James Bond fame. In short, Operation Charlie was the cover code name of the agency exporting Argentine fascism to other client regimes. It had sent military and counterinsurgency men and materiel to fascist regimes in Central America, and now sent such assistance to fascist military juntas in South America. In all cases, it was an operation proxied by the Argentine military and bossed by the U.S. Pentagon/CIA as a branch of Operation Condor. Killing the mothers. In April 1977, the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, a group of mothers whose children had been disappeared, started demonstrating each Thursday in front of the Casa Rosada on the plaza. The Casa Rosada, or Pink House, is Argentina's equivalent to the Gringo White House, and the locale from which presidents have traditionally addressed the nation. We see it dramatically as the setting for Eva Duarte and Juan Perón in the movie Evita. The mothers of the May Plaza were seeking to learn the location and fates of their children. They knew that these children were almost certainly dead, but they needed to know where the bodies were and, if possible, the details of their murders. The government responded in typical CIA mafia manner by killing 2 French nuns and several other founders of the Mothers of the Playa de Mayo in December 1977. Of course, this gained international attention because it's one thing to keep the names of murdered communists and trade unionists out of the press, and quite another to murder the ideological bulwark of the bourgeois state apparatus, the priestesses of Catholicism. The nuns' remains were identified among those bodies washed up on beaches south of Buenos Aires in December of 1977. They were the first well-known victims of the CIA SIDE death flights. Mothers of the May Plaza continued their struggle for justice to this very day, 2015. In 1983, after the restoration of democracy in Argentina, the new government set up the National Commission for Forced Disappearances, Spanish initials for which are CONADEP, C-O-N-A-D-E-P. At its head, they placed the writer Ernesto Sabato. CONADEP took testimony about victims of the fascist CIA regime, documenting hundreds of secret prisons and detention centers. Hundreds. It was able to identify the organizers of the torture and members of the death squads. 2 years later, at the trial of the juntas, CONADEP succeeded in proving the crimes of the top officers of the various fascist juntas of what they called the National Reorganization Process. Top officers were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, including Jorge Rafael Videla, Emilio Eduardo Macera, Roberto Eduardo Viola, Armando Lambruscini, Raul Agosti, Ruben Grafina, Leopoldo Galtieri, Jorge Anaya, and Brasilio Lamidoso. Escaping justice. However, the government of Raul Alfonso passed 2 amnesty laws protecting military officers involved in what they called human rights abuses. The first was the 1986 Ley de Punto Final, Law of Closure, and the second was the 1987 Ley de Obediencia Debida, Law of Due Obedience, that ended prosecution of crimes committed during the Dirty War. In 1989 to 1990, President Carlos Menem pardoned the leaders of the junta who were serving sentences in what he said was an attempt in reconciliation and healing. Clinton gives up the Bush gang abroad. Now, in the late 1990s, U.S. President Bill Clinton ordered the declassification of thousands of State Department documents related to U.S. Argentine activities going back to 1954. These documents proved U.S. direction of the South American Dirty War via Operation Condor under George H.W. Bush. It would be many years before these 2 men got into the mutual forgiveness mode, and after the Bush Republicans tried to impeach Clinton over his Oval Office blowjob. Back in the dock, following continuous protests by the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and other human rights groups in 2003, the Argentine Congress, counting on President Nestor Kirchner and the ruling majority on both chambers' full support, repealed the amnesty laws. The Argentine Supreme Court, under separate review, declared them unconstitutional in June of 2005. This enabled the government to renew prosecutions of crimes committed during the Dirty War, and this earned the bitter, ongoing enmity of the U.S. imperialists. The gringo imperialist bosses launched a never-ending campaign to discredit the Kirchner husband and wife team that continues to this day. The team is not continuing to this day because Mr. Kirchner died, but the campaign against his wife and against everything he stood for continues. She will be replaced in the election that's being held in a few days. DINA civil agent Enrique Arancibia Clavel, who was prosecuted in Argentina for crimes against humanity in 2004, was sentenced to life imprisonment for his part in the murder of General Prats. Italian terrorist Stefano de Chie, who was involved in the murder as well, and Vincenzo Vinciguerra testified in Rome in December 1995 before federal judge Maria Servini de Cubria that DINA agents Clavel and Michael Townsley, a CIA agent, were directly involved in this assassination. In 2003, Judge Servini de Cubria requested that Mariana Callejas, Michael Townsley's wife, and Christopher Willicke, a retired colonel from the Chilean army, be extradited. They were accused of being involved in the murder. A Chilean appeals court judge, Nibaldo Segura, refused extradition 10 years ago in July 2005 because they had already been prosecuted in Chile. Plan B today. On March 5, 2013, 25 former high-ranking military officers from Argentina and Uruguay went on trial in Buenos Aires charged with conspiracy to kidnap, disappear, torture, and kill 171 political opponents during the 1970s and 1980s. Among the defendants are former Argentine presidents Jorge Videla and Reinaldo Bignone from the period of El Proceso. Prosecutors are basing their case in part on U.S. documents declassified in the 1990s and later and obtained by the non-governmental organization, the National Security Archive, based at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. The next principal focus was Brazil. President Fernando Henrique Cardoso ordered the release of some military files concerning Operation Condor in 2000. That year, Italian Attorney General Giancarlo Capaldo, who was investigating the disappearances of Italian nationals in Latin America due to action by Argentinian, Chile, Paraguayan, and Brazilian military thugs, accused 11 Brazilians of involvement. According to the official statement, the Italian government, quote, could not confirm nor deny that Argentine, Brazilian, Paraguayan, and Chilean military officers will be submitted to a trial. As of December 2009, nobody in Brazil had been convicted of human rights violations for actions committed under the 21 years of military dictatorship. Kidnapping Uruguayans. Operation Condor expanded its clandestine repression from Uruguay to Brazil in November 1978. In Brazil, it began with the event later known as Secuestro dos Uruguayos, or the kidnapping of the Uruguayans. It was the CIA organized and implemented via the state apparatus of the Brazilian military regime. Senior officers of the Uruguayan army secretly crossed the border and entered Porto Alegre, capital of the state of Rio Grande do Sul. There they kidnapped Universindo Rodriguez and Lilian Celeberte, an activist Uruguayan couple of the political opposition, along with her two children, Camilo and Francesca, 5 and 3 years old. This secrecy failed because two Brazilian journalist reporters, Luis Claudio Cunha and photographer João Baptista Scalco from Veja magazine, had been warned by an anonymous telephone call that the Uruguayan couple had been disappeared, quote unquote. To check on the information, the two journalists went to the given address, which was an apartment in Porto Alegre. When they arrived, the journalists themselves were at first taken to be other political opposition members by the kidnappers who had seized Celeberte and they were taken in turn. Universindo Rodriguez and the children had already been clandestinely taken to Uruguay. The journalists had exposed the secret operation by their presence. The exposure of the operation is believed to have prevented the murder of the couple and their 2 young children, because the news of the political kidnapping of Uruguayan nationals in Brazil made headlines in the Brazilian press. It became an international scandal. The military governments of both Brazil and Uruguay were embarrassed. A few days later, the CIA arranged for the Celebrity's children be taken to their maternal grandparents in Montevideo, and for Rodriguez and Celebrity to be imprisoned and tortured in Brazil. Afterwards, they were taken to military prisons in Uruguay and detained for the next 5 years. When democracy was restored in Uruguay in 1984, the couple was released. They confirmed all the published details of their kidnapping. In 1980, Brazilian courts convicted 2 inspectors, João Augusto da Rosa and Orandir Portassi Lucas, of the Department of Political and Social Order, DOPS, the secret police branch in charge of Condor operations in Brazil, for having arrested the journalists in Lillian's apartment in Porto Alegre. DOPS was one of the illegal fascist instruments of the military regime. The reporters and their Uruguayan victims had identified these 2 as having taken part in the kidnapping, and their Uruguayan victims had identified them. So this event proved the direct involvement of the Brazilian government in the CIA's Condor operation. In 1991, Governor Pedro Simon arranged for the state of Rio Grande do Sul to officially recognize the kidnapping of the Uruguayans and gave them financial compensation. The democratic government of President Luis Alberto Lacalle in Uruguay was inspired to do the same thing in 1992. Police officer Pedro Selig, the head of the DOPS, at the time of the kidnapping, was identified by the Uruguayan couple as the man in charge of the operation in Porto Alegre. When Selig was prosecuted in Brazil, Universindo and Lelan were still in prison in Uruguay and were prevented from testifying. The Brazilian policeman was acquitted for lack of evidence. Lillian and Universindo's later testimony revealed that 4 officers of the secret Uruguayan Counterinformation Division, 2 majors and 2 captains, took part in the operation with the consent of the Brazilian authorities. Captain Glaucu Yanon was personally responsible for the torturing of Universindo Rodriguez in the DOPS headquarters in Porto Alegre. Although Universindo and Lillian identified the Uruguayan military men who had arrested and tortured them, not one was prosecuted in Montevideo. The law of impunity, passed in 1986, provided amnesty to Uruguayan citizens who had committed acts of political repression and human rights abuses under the dictatorship. Cuno and Scalco are awarded the 1979 Esso Prize, the most important prize of the Brazilian press, for their investigative journalism of the case. Hugo Corres, a former Uruguayan political prisoner, was the one who had called Cunha in warning. In 1993, he said to the Brazilian press, "All the Uruguayan kidnapping abroad, about 180 people, are missing to this day. The only ones who managed to survive are Lillian, her children, and Universindo." CIA Condor operation organizes the assassination of President João Goulart. After being overthrown, João Goulart was the first Brazilian president to die in exile. He was murdered in his sleep in Mercedes, Argentina, on the 6th of December, 1976. The thug regime tried to make it look like a heart attack, but this did not fool anyone. The CIA was trying out some new medical schemes they would later perfect in the murders of Andropov and Chernenko. On 26 April 2000, former governor of Rio de Janeiro and Rio Grande do Sul, Leonel Brizola, alleged that ex-presidents João Goulart and Juscelino Kubitschek, who died in a CIA staged car accident, were assassinated as part of Operation Condor. He asked investigations to be reopened into their deaths. On the 27th of January 2008, the newspaper Folha de Sao Paulo printed a story with a statement from Mario Neira Barreiro, an intelligence service member under Uruguay's dictatorship. Barreiro said that Goulart was poisoned. When democracy was restored in Uruguay in 1984, the couple was released. They confirmed all the published details of their kidnapping. Barreiro said Goulart had been poisoned, confirming Brzola's allegations. Barreiro explained the mechanics. The CIA gave the order to assassinate Goulart through Sergio Paranhos Fleury. At that time, Paranhos Fleury was head of the Department of Political and Social Order, and the license to kill came from President Ernesto Geisel. In July 2008, a special commission of the Legislative Assembly of Rio Grande do Sul, Goulart's home state, concluded that the evidence that Django, that was Goulart's nickname, was willfully assassinated with knowledge of the Geisel government, and it is very strong. In March 2009, the magazine Carta Capital published previously unreleased documents of the National Intelligence Service created by an undercover agent who was present at Django's properties in Uruguay. This revelation was additional proof that the former president was poisoned. The Goulart family has not yet identified who could be the B agent, as he is referred to in the documents. The agent acted as a close friend to Django and described in detail an argument during the president's 56th birthday party with his son because of a fight between two employees. As a result of the story, the Human Rights Commission of the Chamber of Deputies decided to investigate Django's death. Later, Carta Capital published an interview with Django's widow, Maria Teresa Fontela Goulart, who revealed documents from the Uruguayan government that documented her complaints that her family was being monitored. The Uruguayan government was monitoring Django's travel, his business, and his political activities. These files were from 1965, a year after the coup in Brazil, proving he had been deliberately attacked. The Movement for Justice and Human Rights and the President João Goulart Institute have requested the document referring to the Uruguayan Interior Minister because of the serious and responsible Brazilian sources report a plot against the former Brazilian president. Plan B against Brazil today. The CIA continues its campaign of organizing chaos against Brazil today. Its central feature is the never-ending campaign against former President Lula and the ongoing campaign against current President Dilma Rousseff. The U.S. CIA specific objective is to split Brazil into several new countries, including countries based around Sao Paulo, Rondônia, Manaus, Tabatinga, and Rio Brasilia. The next principal focus of Condor was Chile. Now, not all international revenge was to be avoided forever. Fascist dictator Chilean General Augusto Pinochet was arrested in London in 1998 by order of Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón. Garzón wanted Pinochet's extradition to Spain. Accordingly, the international warrant provided additional information concerning Condor, provided by the lawyers seeking the thug president's extradition. They said Pinochet attempted to assassinate Carlos Altamirano, leader of the Chilean Socialist Party. Proof offered for the warrant detailed how Pinochet had met Italian neo-fascist terrorist Stefano Letellier during Francisco Franco's funeral in Madrid in 1975. There, at that funeral, those two arranged to have Altamirano murdered. Additional specifications charged Pinochet with the murder of other Spanish citizens. In the event, the conspirators' plans had been foiled, but not for lack of trying. Chilean Judge Juan Guzman Tapia eventually established a legal precedent concerning the crime of permanent kidnapping, which is what he called it. Namely, that since the bodies of victims kidnapped and presumably murdered could not be found, he deemed that the kidnapping was ongoing. This circumvented the impunity intention of laws subsequently passed claiming the offense occurred so long ago that the perpetrators were protected by an amnesty decree in 1978. Alternatively, Pinochet's defenders gave the legal defense that his arrest violated the Chilean statute of limitations. General Carlos Prats. Chilean General Carlos Prats and his wife were killed by a car bomb on 30th of September 1974 in Buenos Aires, where they lived in exile. The Chilean DINA had been held responsible. The U.S. CIA entered the picture, hiring lawyers to do anything and everything possible to stop the prosecution of the responsible Chilean officials, as they feared that such a trial would inevitably expose their behind-the-scenes direction of the kidnapping, torture, and murder. In Chile, Judge Alejandro Solis terminated the prosecution of Pinochet in January 2005 after the Chilean Supreme Court rejected his demand to revoke Pinochet's immunity from prosecution as chief of state. The leaders of DINA, including Chief Manuel Contreras, ex-chief of operations and retired General Raul Iturriaga Newman, his brother Raul Iturriaga, and ex-brigadiers Pedro Espinosa Bravo and Jose Sara, were charged in Chile with this assassination. To date, only DINA agent Enrique Arancibia Clavel has been convicted in Argentina for this murder. Another famous case is that of Bernardo Leighton. Bernardo Leighton and his wife were severely injured by gunshots on 5 October 1976 while in exile in Rome, Italy. According to declassified documents in the National Security Archive, and Italian Attorney General Giovanni Salvi, Stefano Letellier met with Michael Townley, CIA agent, and Virgilio Paz Romero in Madrid in 1975. They concocted the plan to murder Bernardo Leighton with the help of Franco's secret police. Salvi had considerable experience in finding and prosecuting Condor criminals. For example, he led the prosecution of former DINA head Manuel Contreras. And then there was the assassination of Orlando Letellier. Another Condor target was Orlando Letellier, a former minister of the Chilean Allende government. Letellier had been appointed Chile's ambassador to the United States while Salvador Allende was in power. He was one of the first members of Allende's former government arrested by the Pinochet regime after having been recalled to Santiago. However, he was released 12 months later due to pressure from Venezuela. Letellier was ordered to leave Chile, upon which he moved to Washington, D.C. He then spent his time lobbying the U.S. Congress and European embassies to act against Pinochet's illegal fascist regime. For this reason, he became the voice of Chile's resistance movement. He then got a job as Director of Planning and Development at the Institute for Policy Studies. Ronnie Moffat was Letellier's assistant at the Institute. On September 21, 1972, as Letellier and Miss Moffat traveled to work with Moffat's husband, Michael, the car they were driving suddenly exploded. Ronnie Moffat had only recently been married and was 26 years old that day when she was riding with her husband and her employer. Letellier and Moffat both later died at the hospital. Ronnie's husband, Michael, survived the blast. The CIA had targeted Letellier and decided to use DINA as the assassination operator as soon as Letellier moved to the United States. The Chilean government had revoked Letellier's citizenship only several days before the explosion that killed him. The U.S. Department of Justice investigators found out that DINA chief Colonel Manuel Contreras organized the assassination by bombing of Letellier and Moffat. Well, we're getting close to the end of this tape, so I'm going to have to stop this tape right here. We'll continue with this subject and visit the rest of these Operation Condor countries in the second part of this lecture, after which we are going to move on to each of the countries that we talked about in detail before, country by country: Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Ecuador, and so on.